So welcome back, everybody. I am pleased to invite Abi McCluskey back with me again for our
Hello.
little pod series we're doing here. We've agreed to meet once a month, so you'll be pleased to know that there are going to be more coming along. But because we are both therapists of the therapy block clearance, we want to be able to talk about it from the perspective that we work and the philosophy that we work. So it has an understanding of the subconscious mind, but it also can have a spiritual bias and to be able to follow our soul journey and understand the lessons that we're learning here. So we'd like to explore that more on these podcasts. So in thinking about what we could do today, we are going to talk about powerlessness. And again, both as therapists, we were discussing, well, what are you getting a lot of at the moment? And it does tend to come in clusters, doesn't it, Abi? You know, clients will come with the same kind of thing. And powerlessness does seem to be a theme for both of us. So we thought it's timely that we do it this week. So before we go into the show, I'd just like to say hello, Abi. How are you doing?
Darling. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I am good. We are just recovering from the floods here.
Yes.
Yes, we've been on red alert in Marbella, but I'd like to say Marbella let us off lightly. So.
Oh, good. I hope everybody stays safe.
The power of the weather right now. Mother Earth, is she in power over right now?
It feels like it.
Yeah. So, Abi, how would you define powerlessness?
Oh, goodness. So powerlessness for me, what I see when I have clients coming in is where somebody feels they have no control, they have no agency, they have no ability to make their own decisions a lot of the time. They feel that they are under the power and control of somebody else often. And that, whenever we have somebody who comes in with that sort of experience, and often they will come in because they feel that they are powerless in a relationship. That is usually the catalyst for somebody. Often they feel they've been powerless in all of their relationships, and therefore at some point they recognize that this is something they don't want to repeat. And what we do, you and I do, obviously, is when we talk to somebody, we are trying to understand what they experienced in childhood that initially created that pattern. Because as we know, all of our patterns come from our experiences between coming into the womb to age 5. And when somebody presents with that constant repeating of being attracted or attracting people that they feel take their power, we know that they have felt very powerless in some way, shape, or form as a child.
And powerlessness doesn't just show itself as someone doing something to us. Powerlessness is also someone taking power from someone as well. It's there's an imbalance here. It's a power over or an under or a powerless.
Absolutely. And I think what we find is when people experience that powerlessness as a child, they will go one of two ways. They will either become that powerless person and be continually abused or bullied or feel victimized, or their subconscious will create a pattern where they believe they can only have power if they take it from somebody else, and then they become the destructive power taker. So absolutely, you have two very extreme different behaviors, but they're both coming from the same base root from our perspective.
Which are both unhealed places. Yes. And our work is to bring the people back in balance so that they are more objective about it and can keep a sense of their own boundaries, because the powerlessness is an invasion of boundaries, isn't it? It's they are missing throughout childhood. So let's look at the origins of powerlessness. It is a root cause, but it's something that we've experienced as we are growing up. So it can happen in utero, in the womb, which we'll come back to, but also when children come in and babies come in, they're very sensitive to their environment. They're picking up on cues, and checking out who's safe, who's not. In our first 5 years of life, our primary patterning years, we get a sense of who we are, how we fit into the world, how the world sees us. And so those cues are picked up with how people interact in our own family.
Yeah.
So say more about those origins of how we pick up that powerlessness pattern.
So often what we see is somebody, so if we look at utero, for instance, of actually having that pattern created before you are physically born, that can often happen in an example where, say, mum felt very powerless and she felt that she didn't have any power and control while she was pregnant. And if that child is female, that child may well absorb mum's pattern and belief that as a woman, I will have no power in this lifetime. So even before they've come in and be birthed, they are predispositional to the expectation that as a female, they will not have any power. So we can create it even from before we are physically here. But when we arrive, often we see it comes from somebody who had a very controlling parent and they felt they had no power and control. They weren't allowed to make any decisions for themselves. They were constantly told that they were wrong, that they were worthless. Whenever they tried to do something, they were stopped. So it can come from that very controlling parent. It can come from a very controlling sibling, a sibling who is unhappy that that child has now been born and therefore bullies them, makes them feel very powerless. Obviously, we have the very obvious powerless triggers when a child experiences abuse, whether that be sexual, physical, extreme emotional abuse. All of these things will then create a disconnection to that person's individual power. And as we've said, they will either then become the powerless person or become the destructive power taker.
And so in that powerless place, when you're downloading that information from mum, how is the baby picking up on that information?
So when we're in the womb, from 3 months, we absolutely will pick up and feel what mum is feeling. From 7 months, we will start to be influenced by other members, primarily dad, maybe grandparents, siblings. But if mum is very fearful for this child, or as we said, she is in a position where she feels she has no power and control, then that child can feel every part of it. If we haven't learned how to protect our babies in womb, which most of us don't know how to do because we're not taught to do that. From a soul perspective, and we can come on to this a little bit more, that child will have chosen mum, recognizing that there is a powerless pattern running there, and they have chosen to come in order to learn how to balance their power.
So let's talk more about bringing that pattern in and choosing mum and dad for that pattern.
Yeah.
So as part of our work in block clearance is understanding the emotional patterns that we're carrying, and patterns that are brought in, when we want to come in and we choose our team to help us learn this. It's because in past lives, our soul has been on a journey where we've experienced that in a previous life. So can you tell us more about that, why those patterns are coming back in?
So, as we've talked about, Deb, our belief system is that as souls, we're all on a journey to learn how to balance our emotions. And therefore, we will choose lifetimes in order to learn specific lessons. And one of those lifetimes for all of us will be to learn balanced power. So if we've had a previous lifetime where we either felt we got stuck in the powerlessness, or we felt we went into that destructive power taking, once we've returned to spirit and analysed that life, we recognise that we didn't learn what we wanted to, which was that of balanced power. And then depending on which way we had gone in that previous lifetime, we may either choose to come in and live a similar experience, knowing that this time we'll give ourselves more help to break it, or we may choose to come in and live it from the opposite extreme. So if we've had a lifetime where we did feel we took power very destructively, we may well choose on a soul level to come back and experience that from the different perspective. from the complete powerlessness in the hope that if we didn't learn it from one direction, we're more likely to learn it from another.
And so when we're going through our life, if we've got that root pattern of powerlessness, we're also choosing relationships that are helping us to teach us power, a balanced power. But I've noticed in my life is that I have picked relationships with power over, but I've also flipped over and had other relationships where I've been in the power position to be able to see it from a perspective. So it doesn't necessarily happen in the past life and you choose to come in and be powerless in this lifetime. You can learn it from both perspectives.
Yes, and you can see people, and we have some clients who are very powerless in a particular situation. It might be in their personal relationship, but actually they're very powerful in their professional relationship. And in some cases, they go into that destructive power in that professional relationship, to your point, because they are trying to find a way to balance the two and come back into connecting to their own power.
Yeah, to take something back.
Yeah,
that they've lost. So let's talk about the patterns, because we've just started to touch on that. Why do we go on to choose people in our life as we grow up? If we know as children that, well, that didn't feel good and I didn't like that, and then my mother or my father made me feel bad, why do we go on and choose it again?
Because it becomes very comfortable. And by comfortable, we don't mean pleasant or happy, but familiar. And our subconscious loves familiarity. So, for instance, if we have had an experience where we felt very powerless and we've stayed in that pattern, it's almost like an energetic light bulb comes on above our heads. And therefore, if we walk into a room and there is somebody who is in destructive power-taking mode, subconsciously we will recognize that energy and it will feel very familiar to us. Similarly, for that person, they are in that room looking for that light bulb. They can energetically sense it because they are only interested in being in a relationship with somebody that they feel they can have power from. So the two naturally come together. And
so how do you explain that? Because clients quite often say, well, I didn't know that they were going to take power over me. How do we explain that
because
we gravitate?
It's not a conscious thing. Energetically, we are attracted to people that we either feel understand our patterns, share our patterns, or mirror our patterns. So when you walk into a room and you've never met somebody and you either love them or you hate them, that's not a conscious physical exchange, that's an energy exchange. So if you're really drawn to somebody, it's because you see in their energetic field somewhere, they're carrying a pattern that means they're going to understand yours. Similarly, if somebody repels you, often it's because they carry a pattern that you really dislike about yourself and you don't want to engage with it. So we have to be very clear with our clients that they're not choosing this because they're stupid or they're weak or they're idiots. They're choosing it because their subconscious, although it might not enjoy feeling powerless, it knows how to cope with it. And it believes because they are still alive by this point, it's actually keeping them safe. So they might hate it on a conscious level, but they know subconsciously how to deal with it. And therefore, and I often get this, and I'm sure you do as well, Deb, when we're talking to a client who has been in a very, let's say, controlling relationship and they have felt very powerless, it will always come, 9 times out of 10, if it's female, they'll have had a very controlling dad. And when they meet that partner, they don't understand why they're so attracted to them. They think it's because they're a strong, commanding individual that will keep them safe. But actually, on an energetic level, they've just met their father in another form, and their father is very familiar to them.
Is there also a part that energetic draw that believes that they can get that they're getting the opposite when actually, in fact, they're getting very like?
Yes, a lot of the time people believe they're choosing something completely different, and it's not until further down the line. Because again, when we meet, as I said, we're drawn subconsciously, but we go into our conscious mind, don't we? And we're the best versions of ourselves when we first get together. So the destructive power taker will not be taking power at that point. because they'll recognize on some level if they go in really heavy, that person's going to run away. It tends to be a very gradual thing. And also the powerless person is not going to go into that relationship showing that they are powerless. They're going to appear to be stronger than they actually are until they are then challenged by the destruction. And that's when the true patterns will start to come out. But no, I don't think anybody ever consciously chooses a partner thinking, I am going to take power from this person. Or indeed anyone chooses a partner thinking, I'm going to let this person take all my power away. It's purely a subconscious thing, which is why it's so difficult to break on your own a lot of the time. Because no matter how strong you want to feel, if you've not had that baseline as a child, it's really difficult to work out how to do it because your subconscious doesn't know how to do it in this lifetime.
Well, as we're children, we don't know what healthy love is. We just know what the love is that we're receiving.
Exactly.
And if that is our version of love to be shouted at or to be given into, then that's what we believe love to be. And we can get caught in those relationships and not want to let go of them in case, well, if I don't get that love again, then I'll just stick with this because I'll wait for the moments that I do get what I know.
Yes. And you often have self-worth, disconnection to self-worth and self-value wrapped up in that. So again, there can be an element of somebody just not believing that they deserve anything more than this, because that's what they've experienced and that's what they've been told they deserve. You know, what we tell our children when they are young, either through our actions or our words, really powerful. Really powerful. If you tell somebody that they are worthless enough as a child, they will absolutely believe it as an adult.
Well, everything is a truth at that point, and until we grow up, or we go to school and we can measure ourselves against other people. It is a truth then. Yeah. But then by then it's so fixed in our brains, isn't it? That pattern is so fixed.
Yeah.
So how do we go on to break the cycle?
It is not necessarily difficult to break the cycle once you've recognized it. First off is being able to recognize it. And often, I certainly find, Deb, I'm sure you're probably the same, that most of our clients have gone through this loop several times before they will go, hold on a minute. And often something quite extreme will have happened for them to recognize, okay, this is happening again. I think what makes it difficult a lot of the time for people to seek help is they feel such shame, particularly if they've been the powerless one. I don't know if you've seen that Netflix show that's just come out, the documentary. I think it's My Wife, My Abuser.
No.
Very interesting one you want to unpack. But in this case, the female is the destructive power taker. The male is the powerlessness one. But you could feel his shame and his critical self-judgment that he had allowed this to happen for so long. And often I think that's what stops people either breaking out of that relationship or seeking help, because they will be fearing for their safety sometimes. But I think just as importantly is those critical and negative thoughts that they hold about themselves prevent them through shame or guilt or fear or whatever it is from even admitting to anybody that it's happening, let alone then seeking help. You know, quite often if I've got clients who have been in this sort of relationship, it will not necessarily be the initial contact, and they'll book and then they'll cancel and then they'll rebook and then they'll cancel and then they'll be having anxiety and they'll cancel, and all of that will be wrapped up in there. This is my fault. I'm an idiot. I deserve this. What did I do? All of those things. So it takes great strength actually to be in that sort of relationship. And I think our job is to help our clients recognize that this is not about blame or judgment or staying in the shame or guilt. It's about understanding where did that pattern come from so we can break it for you. Or you can break it for you with our help. Reconnect to your balanced power, because if you're in that balanced power, you're not going to attract a destructive power taker. They won't be interested in you.
No. And it can be particularly difficult for men coming to discuss a powerlessness issue if they're in a relationship with a woman that is taking that power over them. It can be quite shameful and emasculating, and it's hard to be vulnerable in those situations. But to be able to understand that there's some kind of feminine powerlessness in there in their timeline.
Yeah.
Most likely mother or grandmother that has taken that from them, and to realize that it's something that they've learnt, and rather than that they're weak within the relationship, they've picked that particular person to either believe they're going to be different or to learn from it.
Another great example, actually, of the different ways in which people pull pattern in a relationship is that Netflix documentary Monsters, the Menendez brothers. That's such a great, I mean, it's a great show anyway, but if you believe that story, it also shows you how it's generational in its pattern, because it was clear that the father, Jose, experienced extreme powerlessness in his lifetime as a child from the conversations he had with his mother. And then he became the destructive power taker with his boys and with his wife. Come back to her, she was quite interesting. And then you had the boys, you had the older boy, Lyle, who stayed in the powerlessness for a while and then went into the destructive power taking, when he then also abused his brother Eric. And Eric stayed in the powerless pattern until obviously the night that they decided to take their power back in the most destructive way possible. And their mother, for me, was interesting because she was doing what I think you referred to, Deb, was sometimes she was very powerless and sometimes she went into the destructive power taking. And if you look back at therefore, we didn't really understand too much about Kitty's childhood, but we must assume there must have been powerlessness she experienced, and certainly was alluded to, I think. But even if you trace it back, for Jose's mother to be that destructive power taker, she must have experienced powerlessness, and so it goes on. And when you can trace it back, you can see that often these are familial and ancestral patterns, that therefore it's going to be even more difficult to break because you've had generation after generation reinforcing that.
Yeah. And when there was an Instagram post that I saw about powerlessness, and it showed how powerlessness can be transferred into different situations. So the man was at work and he was being bullied by the boss. He came home, then he bullied his wife. Then the wife then bullied the child, and then the child then bullied the cat.
Yes, absolutely.
Because we're all just trying to transfer it in order to try and balance ourselves.
Yeah.
And I've never talked about this on a podcast before, but powerlessness is my root, one of my root issues, the big root issues. It is our ancestral root issue too, and has been passed down from both sides of my family. And being able to see it this way and understand where the root comes from can completely eliminate the blame and shame. It's taken time to get to that point, but I can look back and see that my parents were products of their parents, and in the work, I've done with you in clearing, I can take it back to in utero. Then I know that my mum was feeling powerless. She was very young. She was pregnant. She was scared. She was in a town that she didn't know anybody. She found herself living with a family that she didn't know, because my parents got together quite quickly because they were pregnant with me very young. So all that fear and all that helplessness and powerlessness my mum was feeling, with two young parents trying to get together. They were 18, and so they hadn't worked themselves out. And so it was understandable that I was going to inherit that. And they were two unhealed people bringing me up. And I had to work that out much later on.
Yeah. And
so, relationships have played out in my life where I have been the power over my marriage. I definitely, in those early years, took that power over. And, it's an uncomfortable place to be, to realize that I took that position. But I took that position because I was scared. I took that because I was unhealed and didn't understand what was happening at me. But my first defense when challenged was to take power over. Until one day my husband turned on me to try and hold that boundary. And I realized, this doesn't work. I can't do this anymore. And it just knocked me back into balance. But I then from then had a subsequent series of relationships that took me into powerless. And that's been the hardest place to pull myself out of, really. But each time I see the signs quicker, and each time I've shored up my boundaries to the point that I can see it straight away now. So it's definitely found its balance, but that's taken 55 years to get to that point. So when you say, of course, we can change it quickly, but it takes a long time to filter that out and retrain the brain. But yes, it can be done. It can be done.
Yeah.
And then you can start to attract a different kind of person into your life that you don't need to see that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's something else
that they're there to show you.
Yeah, there's another route that I didn't know I had.
Everybody's here to show us something. But yes, and I have to say, it is one of the patterns, and I'm sure because you've personally done it, Deb, it's one of the patterns that when you can see a client really have that light bulb moment, come out of the judgment and the shame of themselves and go, oh my God, yes, I can absolutely see that this is powerlessness and I want to get my power back. And when you work with them and you feel them standing in that power, it's just amazing to watch.
When you start to see them facing their greatest fears, what are huge fears when they come to us, at the right time, they find the right words because they've grown inside and they're not. So our work is a lot about going back to that inner child. We go back in our sessions to go and meet that inner child because it's the inner child who is stuck.
Yeah.
And so when we can identify and empathize with that child rather than be angry with them, because a lot of our power over is the anger towards that inner child in us, that the person in front of us is mirroring back that submissive child that was probably us, or was not allowed to be submissive, had to be tough. So therefore to show vulnerability is not okay either. So when we can start to connect with that inner child in us and find some compassion and forgiveness that, I didn't know any other way. My dad could be scary. I just had to survive. But my youngest brother, he used fight. So we just find our own way.
Yeah. And it's, to your point, at the end of the day, a lot of the time it's about forgiveness. Forgiving your parents if you feel you need to, forgiving yourself.
Yeah.
For then carrying on that pattern and just starting to be quite gentle and loving with yourself. And I think, and it's easy to say, it's not always difficult to hear, but to your point, Deb, every parent does do the best that they can. It might be terrible. It is not to say that every parent is good. Some parents are atrocious at parenting, but they are doing it based on what they learned and their patterns. And if you can break an ancestral pattern on behalf of that whole line, that's a huge achievement. But it's also quite interesting for me in powerlessness because it's quite polarizing, isn't it? I'm sure from that documentary that I saw with where the female was the destructive caretaker, and my goodness, was she. But what we do is we tend to victimize the abused and demonize the abuser. And I understand that because it's totally, emotionally, you're watching this and going, oh my God, how can this be happening? But from a therapist's perspective, it's really important to remember they're coming from the same base. Their behaviours have manifested very differently, but both of those individuals are in extreme fear of having no power. One of them plays it out by that absolute anger, rage, abuse of somebody else, and the other plays it out in cowering and being scared and being beaten or being abused in whatever way. But for us to help them, we've got to come out of the judgment of any of that and look at, okay, this is a powerless pattern. How do we help you regain power?
And that's one of the things that can keep us stuck in power over or powerlessness is the rage and the judgment towards the person that did it to us. Because that then we're handing over our power. Every time we get angry with them, we're handing our power back over to them and losing it. So when we work with our clients, it's also spending time understanding our parents' story or the abuser's story, is because they have a story and all they're doing is surviving their trauma. and they haven't quite been able to separate themselves from the person in front of them.
Yeah.
And that just takes time.
Yeah, and it's a really difficult thing for most people to wrap their head around, and I totally understand that, because as human beings, you look and you go, how could somebody behave like that? How could somebody do that to somebody else? But I think it comes back to, no matter what awful things people do, nobody does anything for no reason. There will be some subconscious pattern that will be driving somebody to behave in the way that they behave. And I think what I would love is more people to be looking behind the actual behaviour to what is driving that behaviour. Because if we could start to tackle the drivers more, then perhaps we could avoid people becoming the sort of destructive power takers that we see, or that level of powerlessness that somebody has to endure for years, because it's heartbreaking on both sides. But it's very difficult to come out of the human emotion of it because it's shocking for us.
And it's not always common to see power over clients, is it? Because there's a hard thing to admit.
Yes, and I think that's exactly the point, is we see a lot more of powerless clients than power takers, because yes, first of all, you have to get to the point that you can admit you're doing that, and that brings up a huge amount of self-loathing, self-hatred, judgment, a lot of the time excuses, and not wanting to take that responsibility. So yeah, it takes a lot of courage for somebody who's gone into that place to seek help and trust that we are not going to judge them. We're just going to try and help them to not repeat those patterns.
And many of us, for many years, don't actually know that we're in that pattern. It's just a very familiar behavior that we do. And sometimes life happens to us that can give us a different perspective, and quite often that different perspective is when we then go on to have our own children, because our children can then bring up those wounds. And I know certainly that my daughter Megan has been a big part of my learning for that. Is as much as I loved her and as much as I wanted to be that mother that could be there for her and safe for her, my stuff was coming through. And I when I did start therapy, I was going because I was going for power over. But it took a year. It took a whole year before the penny could drop. When my therapist, Penny, actually, said to me, Deb, Megan is not your enemy. Megan is your ally. She's here to show you something about yourself. She is reflecting back that wound. She is powerless to you. And you're just seeing that baby in you. Yeah. And so to take that back, then it just helped me. It just dropped in. And then the work could start. Yeah. Because the first year I was just angry. So, and I know that both my children have come in and they have a powerlessness too. And they've chosen me as their mom to help them, and they have their journey. But if we can change a pattern, we can then help others moving forward, can't we?
Absolutely. And that's another thing, because quite often for both males and females, particularly those that have been in that powerless place and they have children, they then go into the guilt of, what have I done to my children? I've shown them that it's okay for a woman to be treated like this, or a man to behave like this, or a man to be treated like this. And we always have to come back to, depending on where their spiritual views are. If somebody does not believe in soul journeys, then we would not explain it in this way. But, that your children have chosen you to learn from. And if you break the pattern, you are showing them that no matter what the situation is, they can always find a way to take that power back. So actually, in breaking the pattern, you are helping them more, because you're showing them that that is not something they have to stay stuck in. And I think that's been hugely helpful for your kids, Deb.
Yeah.
Look at where they are now.
Yeah. Well, they didn't have to stay in it. They could see another way, and I was there to walk with them.
Yeah.
And they're changing their patterns much earlier than I have.
Yes. Smart. The younger generation seems to be a bit smarter than we were. Getting a lot of younger people. I had that conversation, I think it was with a 16-year-old the other week, and I was saying, I know this feels terrible, but trust me, you're sorting this out early. If you can get this done now, you can enjoy your 20s and your 30s, as opposed to me rocking up when I was 35 or whatever and saying, oh my God, what's going on?
So offering advice to listeners here, what I was saying earlier on, that quite often we don't recognize we're in that powerless position. What advice could you suggest that would give you an indication that you might be?
I think if somebody is in a relationship where they are either scared of their partner and the way their partner behaves, they're scared to say anything or voice anything for fear of repercussions. They feel that they can't do what they want to do without having explicit permission, or they feel that they can't do what they want to do unless their partner approves it. If they feel they have to justify everything that they do, if they feel they're not allowed to go out and be their own person. Now, you might be in a relationship of all of that and you're absolutely happy with that, and that's absolutely fine. But it's where you have that challenge and it's really bothering you and it upsets you, but you don't feel you can do anything about it.
And I think that's the point, isn't it? It's the point when it starts to bother you.
Yes.
When we're asleep and we just accept it as it is, we don't get those feelings. We're just living, existing. But then there is that tipping point where, oh, that doesn't feel right, or you start to feel angry towards the other person, or you're feeling resentful, and you start to recognize there's another way. That's the point of questioning.
Yeah. And what I would say at that point is, if you don't feel you're ready to go and talk to somebody professionally, then if you've got a good friend, talk to them. I mean, actually in this documentary, the way that it came out was this guy finally talked to his friend and said, tell me if I'm overreacting. And of course his friend went, of course you're not overreacting. What? And then he sent him some video evidence, and then it all kicked off. But it's that, because it often, if you're in that relationship, it's become so normalized that that's just your life. And again, if it's not bothering you, then you're not going to do anything about it. But if there's something about it bothering you, then yeah, just even touch base with a friend and say, can I just check? I'm wondering if I'm slightly overreacting, and then get a few perspectives. And then if you can recognize and say, no, actually, clearly I am in a relationship where I am being controlled and I have no power, it's then seeing if you can find the strength to find somebody who can help you with that. Either if you can work out where you think it's come from by looking back on your own life. And if you can't, because we have clients with powerlessness, and when you're talking to them, you're thinking, I don't know where this has come from. I know it must be a pattern because of what they're going through now, but I can't hear anything in their childhood necessarily. And that's when you've got to go back and do some subconscious work to understand where it came from. But I think, first of all, being honest with yourself that you're not okay with what's happening, whether that's you being the destructive power taker or being the powerless one, trying to not then go into the shame and the guilt and the judgment, because that will stop you doing anything about it, because you'll be too busy beating yourself up to then learn anything to move forward. Find a trusted person that you could maybe that you feel won't judge you, won't pity you, but just will listen and go, yeah, actually, that does sound a bit off, or have you thought about that? And then if you feel you cannot then either change or get out of that relationship, if that's what you want to do, then try and find the courage to find somebody who will help you build the strength.
Because with a therapist, that's someone that you can explore the options without having to do anything about it, because that can be a fear for people. Well, if I go and talk about it, it's going to be like a domino effect. And I think when people are ready to deal with it on some subconscious level, they are on that start of that journey to take their power back.
Yeah, absolutely.
But our greatest fear at that point is, oh, well, I might have to leave. Well, no, you don't have to leave, but it could change the dynamics of the relationship also.
And that's something that I think we're very clear, and that's particularly, I have that when you do have somebody and they're going, well, everybody's telling me I'm an idiot. Everybody's telling me that I should leave. And to your point, we would never tell anybody to leave a relationship, because first of all, you've got to understand what is stopping you from leaving in the first place. Because if you can't deal with that, you're not going to leave. And, if you are in this relationship because you are trauma bonded with this person, unless you deal with that trauma, you're never going to be able to set yourself free. And if you do, you'll just go bond with somebody else. So yes, I think it is really important for people to understand that if they find the right therapist, that therapist is not going to judge them and is not going to tell them what to do. It's going to help them work out why they're so unhappy, what they would like to change, and what the possible outcomes are. And if I have somebody, particularly if they're in the powerless pattern and they don't want to leave the relationship, but we're going to start to work on that power, I will always warn them that something's going to shift as a result of that. And you need to be prepared. If we start to build somebody's power up and they're in a relationship with somebody who takes power, that person is going to feel it. And if we're lucky, they recognize that it's changing. And to your point, the dynamics in the relationship change and it settles. If we're not so lucky, that person, the destructive power taker, then ups the ante because they're desperately trying to get it back to the level that they're comfortable with. So again, I will not warn people, but I will say it is possible that if we go down this route, this could happen. You just need to be ready and prepared for it, which I think to your point, Deb, is particularly if somebody wants to stay in the relationship, we're aiming to change that power quite slowly. We're not aiming to flip a switch and suddenly somebody's standing there being all strong and forceful when they haven't been. We're aiming to incrementally make them feel stronger and more powerful every day till they're able to show it, and then that either sorts or resolves their relationship into balance, or they're strong enough to walk away at that point.
I think that point you've just made there takes us nicely on to what would be our next podcast, is about narcissism. Because if it gets to those extremes where someone is stepping up because they're terrified of losing that sense of control, and then the control becomes very destructive, we could be stepping into the field of narcissism. So that's what we're going to talk about in our next session, and thrash that out a bit, because that is something that is becoming more and more familiar in our sessions. And it could be that we are becoming more and more aware of narcissism, and the degrees of that manipulative control that can be extremes, but it's not always on that spectrum. So that's what we'll talk about next time. But I hope for the listeners, this has been a helpful introduction to powerlessness. And if you feel like this has touched something in you, and you feel like you're in a relationship where you are swinging from one to another, it might be a good time for you to source a therapist for yourself. And that can be someone local to you. But if you're interested in the way that we address it, explore it, then Abi, how can they get in touch with you?
The best way is probably through my email address, which is Abi, ABI, @treeoflifecentre.co.uk.
And your sessions can be face-to-face or online, so it doesn't matter where.
Absolutely, yes.
In the
we
world
have clients all over the world.
Yes, sure. And if any of you want to get in touch with me, it will be in the outro of this episode. So thank you very much, Abi. It's very stimulating as always. And I will catch you next time.
All right, take care. Thank you for having me.
See you.
Bye.